Good afternoon. My presentation today will be on the topic of African Americans in sport. I'm going to be particularly looking at how the dynamic changes from the early 20th to the beginning of the 21st century has to how the dynamics of, firstly, the media coverage, and also how, through the developments of the civil rights movement in this time, how the development of these African Americans as commercial stars placed them in the wider race relations in America. So I think the best way to look at this in the time period that we've got is to sort of start at the beginning of this 20th century and look at boxing. Boxing's a massive sport at this time. And in doing so, we're going to look at Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was the first American heavyweight boxing champion between 1908 and 1915. And Johnson was a controversial figure, firstly because America's deeply entrenched in segregated, and also around this time there's lots of scientific theories going around to do with sort of social Darwinism and meaning that whites were genetically superior to blacks, and this is where Jack Johnson's very being was causing uproar, and I think perhaps best typified in his 1910 fight against Jim Jeffries, which was fought on Independence Day, was sort of the beginning of the end for Johnson. His, as said previously, he wasn't media coached; he was his own man. And his demeanour was viewed by the press as one that had no remorse for his opponents, and also his relationship with white women was deeply frowned upon across the media. And as a result, Johnson was, when he was defeated, was never to be seen again in the boxing sphere, and legislation came after this, and it wasn't until some 20 years after that Joe Louis was able to become champion himself. And this rise of Joe Louis is one to look at very, very importantly in this time when sort of analysing how through the civil rights era, how the dynamic changed. So Joe Louis had an extensive amateur boxing career because he was not allowed to fight professionally, and as a result was picked up by management in the early 30s, and Lewis's rise to stardom came from learning from Jack Johnson's demise, and this is how his management saw it. They had to condition him in a way that would appease the white population. So he was his management made very clear and obvious attempts to present him in a way that would not anger the white fans. They took very good care of his hair, presenting it in nice ways, asking him to show very obvious signs of good manners, and as a result of this, Johnson was able to have a career in boxing and was not vilified in the same way that Jack Johnson was. And I think to show how this dynamic was changing in the early 20th century, it's important to look at Jackie Robinson at the same time. They both having careers around very similar times. Jackie Robinson, of course, being the first African American to play Major League Baseball. And Jackie Robinson's demeanour was very, very similar to that of Joe Louis. He was very, very media friendly, willing to answer questions, and would not rise to race baiting questions. He wouldn't want to be seen to get angry on television, and wanted to prove to be someone that the media couldn't attack, basically. And Jackie Robinson was one of, if not one of the best MLB players ever. Resulted in having a 10-year career at the top of baseball, and by the time of his retirement, there was every team in the MLB had a black representative, and I think this is particularly important when looking at sort of questions that were answered by John Hoberman, who was asking whether or not sport was helping preserve racial folklore. And I think these two, in this time, it can be said that racial folklore was an influence in them shaping careers in the way that they did. They didn't want to play up to stereotypes, as they knew that it would negatively impact their career. And I think this is sort of where that dynamic starts to change, is the subsequent, the next boxing champion to look at is Muhammad Ali. Ali was involved in civil rights disputes and was quite active in his political stance. And the change in dynamic here is that the media world was growing. Massive TV coverage of Ali's fights, and he would broadcast around the world. And this was all coinciding with the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the same year that Ali won the title, and the same year that Ali changed his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali. All of this was happening around the same time, and I think that it's important to acknowledge that through this growth of the media and growth of commercialism, Ali was, whilst he was not racially assimilated into US society, he was accepted as a superstar. And I think that's where it's an important moment in this part of history to understand that superstars at this time may not have been accepted for their race, but they're becoming to be accepted for their ability. And this, as just spoken about there, this rise of commercialism, I think it's a really, really important part to look at into the modern, next part of history here, into the late 20th century, into the early 21st century. And I think the best person to look at here is probably Michael Jordan. He won 6 NBA titles between 1991 and 1998. Widely regarded as still the best basketball player of all time. And Michael Jordan played in an era of basketball where 80% of the NBA was 80% of the NBA was African American, and this change in itself is obviously something that the fan base has had to have come accustomed to. It wasn't like the numbers of NBA fans was dropping. However, in being this incredible superstar of the sport, Jordan signed arguably the largest, one of the largest sports contracts of all time. He still owns vast percentages of it now in his brand Air Jordan. These are basketball shoes which are still now donned by NBA stars and also fans alike. Their shoes regularly sell out. They're a fashion piece now, not just a basketball shoe. And I think that goes to just show, firstly, of Michael Jordan's influence, but also to how this came to be in the first place. Jordan was particularly famous for his sort of apolitical stance. He was very reserved. You don't see much insight into his personal life, and that's still apparent now. And I think that's a question that needs to be sort of thought about here, is that, was this a factor in his commercial success? His, he wasn't talking about political things, and was this seen as a positive by Nike in this instance? And also, again, poses a wider question as to whether or not white audiences were, whether they were happy or whether or not they were accepting of the black superstars on TV. And I think it's quite an interesting question to think about. And with all these stars I've just laid in mind, it's obvious to see that from a complete media blackout in the case of Jackson way back in the 20th century, all the way through to creating a multi-millionaire sneaker mogul in the case of Michael Jordan, it's important to understand that there was a massive change in dynamic, especially in the growth of commercialism and the growth of the media, and how there was an ability to profit off these stars but in doing so, they had to be careful as to who would be annoyed at it, and also to not be controversial in doing so. So I think I'm going to just introduce a couple of primary sources here that come from after the eras of all the above, and I think they raise some interesting questions. So one of them's of Charles Barkley, an NBA star, on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and the other is Colin Kaepernick taking in the knee and the subsequent response from the then President Donald Trump. So some of the questions to think about here. So what does the imagery of Charles Barkley suggest about black representation in sport? And was race defining these sports stars? How does the image of Barkley support the idea of whether or not sport is or was preserving racial folklore? And then what role does the media play in that? And then to do with Colin Kaepernick, would Colin Kaepernick have received the same media attention if he were not black? And also, what does the Colin Kaepernick example suggest about how viable political expression is or was for African American sports stars? Thank you for your time today. Cheers.